Howdy, howdy, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Let's Ask Paul. My name is Paul Abernathy, your host, and welcome to our little podcast here. Again, we want to tell everybody out there, there's so many ways you can listen to our podcast. Maybe you've seen me over on TikTok playing around at our @MasterTheNEC, which is our ID. But there's so many ways that you can actually listen to our shows on your phone, on your Alexa devices, Google devices, whatever you like to listen to, or you could just go to one of your favorite podcast listening platforms like Google Podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, iHeartRadio. It doesn't matter. Wherever you get it, all you got to do is just search for Master the NEC, and you'll be able to get all of our podcasts. So thanks for coming and listening, and hopefully you get something out of today's episode, as we're going to look at some questions that were submitted to me via the portal. Now, if you're not familiar with what our portal is, it's a free service that we offer over at paulabernathy.com. Now, it's a service where, look, if you've got code questions, and I do get a lot of questions that are actually practical driven, where the hands-on stuff, and I tend to answer those. They don't all make it to the podcast because it's very, hands-on-y type of approach to teaching it, and it's just something that it really makes it harder to do in a podcast. But code-related stuff, I try to do as many podcasts as I can with code-related stuff in order to be able to get that stuff out there to you. So if you have a code question, by all means, go on over to paulabernathy.com and send us that request, and we will do a podcast and most certainly try to answer via email. But again, if I selected for a podcast, that's what we want to use it for. We want to be able to get a podcast in there. All right, so on today's episode, we're going to look at a couple questions that we have been submitted, and I will do my best to try to answer these for you and give you my insight on it. Whether you agree to disagree, that's totally up to you, but I'm going to give you my take on it anyway. All right, so the first question we have is, hey, Paul, I have 3-story cabin. I'm putting a 200 amp service on. Again, I'm assuming you've done a load calculation. I want to put panel on the first floor, which will be below grade. Can I just run SCU cable out the back of the meter and down to the panel, or do I need to have a means of disconnect since panel will not be directly behind the meter? Well, thank you. Okay, so in this case, depending on where you're at, so you didn't tell me where you were at, and you didn't tell me the code cycle that you're on. So I'm going to assume 2020 code, and always do that, and assume otherwise, because that's the latest published edition. So in the 2020 code, you're going to be required to have a exterior emergency disconnect. Okay, so 230.85. So you're going to have to put an exterior disconnect. Now, if you still want to put the panel down in the first floor, which would be below grade, what you're going to do is you're going to put your emergency disconnect outside, and it could be your service disconnect. So one of the best methods that I usually tell people in this case would simply be get a 200 amp service disconnect, and that's going to be where you go from the meter into that, and then from there it's going to be 4 conductors. So then it's going to be that panel in your first floor is going to be a remote distribution panel. So you're going to run an SCR out of that service disconnect down to the actual remote distribution panel, and you're going to use SCR, R being R for round, service entrance rounds, 2 hots, a neutral, and an equipment ground. Okay, so that exterior disconnect is going to also be your emergency disconnect, and it's going to be your service disconnect. So you can get those 200 amp exterior NEMA 3R disconnects. That's also the service disconnect, and that's where you're going to come out of there. You're going to go to your grounding electrodes and do everything out of that exterior service disconnect. But it's also going to need to be labeled as an emergency disconnect as well. So go check out 230.85, and that's how I would do it. But you most certainly can't come out of the meter down to the fourth floor. Now, you could do this prior to 2020, but you're required for the service entrance conductors to be outside or nearest point of entry have to terminate into the overcurrent protective device. And so if you were to run in the wall and then down the wall, then you wouldn't be immediately adjacent. So again, depending on your jurisdiction, how much of that unprotected service entrance cable they would allow inside of your building. Again, that's from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. My jurisdictions that I worked in, we always tried to be as literal. If you could go back to back, then we would let you, and that would be okay, because the moment it comes in, it terminates into the overcurrent protected device, right? Line side of your service disconnect. There were occasions where we'd let you go up to about 3 feet in Virginia. Again, if it had accommodated where you were putting the panel, it just wasn't practical. Or if you created another hazard by where you put it, then we might give you a little leeway. But you can always run those service entrance conductors on the outside of the building before you penetrate inside, right? So you do have a bunch of options to do that. You also could put an exterior panel, NEMA 3R, with your breakers in it and everything outside, okay? And you wouldn't have that panel down in the first floor like you want it, but then you got to worry about how you route those non-metallic sheath cables, I'm assuming that's what you're running, into that exterior panel, and then that becomes a headache in itself, right? So you have some options, but the way I would probably do it, again, is go from a meter, right next to it, hit a 200 amp exterior service disconnect, and also that would be my emergency disconnect, and that becomes the service location. And then from there, I'd run SER and then go in and run down the wall to wherever I want to put my actual remote distribution panel. Remember, all your grounding electrodes and all that stuff is going to go to that outside service disconnect, not to the panel inside. Okay, make sense? Okay, that's how I would address that one. So go check out 230.85. See those rules that are associated with that, of course, for your grounding electrodes and all that, 250.50 and 250.52, and follow all those rules. I think you got it, so you ought to be able to get it. All right, so we're going to look at another question and try to knock another one out. Okay, so this one ought to be very quick, and again, I'll have somebody comment and say something about self-promotion. I know, I get it every time, but here, this question is submitted, and I will use your name. This is a first for me because you asked for it, Toby. You say, do you have any prep courses for the Master Electrician State Exam? Absolutely, Toby. We have exam prep programs, but we call it the Fast Tracks Black program. Now, that's your base program, but the reason I'm answering this question for you is because we just launched back on the 22nd of last month. We just launched what's called the Fast Tracks Black program with the plus. So we call that the Fast Tracks Plus. Just get rid of the black. The difference is the Fast Tracks Black gives you our course, but it doesn't give you access to all of our videos and podcasts and stuff that are exclusive on our website. It also doesn't give you access to any of the little mini courses that we have on the website, things like that, like the 12-hour grounding and bonding and the swimming pool webinar that we did. You have to be an annual member to get that. So the Fast Tracks Plus just incorporates that annual membership, and when you sign up for the program, you set it up, go set up your user account on the website, and then once you do that, we will give you full access to everything, and that's what the Plus is. So you're going to get the Fast Tracks, you're going to get the exam prep course, which you have access for 12 months, okay? And we do offer extensions if necessary, but you get access for 12 months. And then with the Plus, you're going to get access to all exclusive videos. Anything new that we put out, you're going to get access to it for a full year. Okay? So that's the difference. So that's the Plus. If you want the videos, then that's the Plus. If you just want the program, the course, the most popular course we offer is the Fast Tracks Black that teaches exam prep. Doesn't matter which state you're in, as long as it's an NEC-based exam, and most of them are. And even if you're doing ICC testing for residential, commercial inspector, the course is great for that too. It goes way deeper than you probably need for your ICC exam, but it's really gets you fundamentally understanding the National Electrical Code. Okay, so hopefully that answers your question. All you got to do is go over to our website, electricalcodeacademy.com or .net or .org. It doesn't matter. Or you can go to fasttrackssystem.com, .net. .org. Okay, and you can find out more information on our programs there. So check that out. Hopefully that'll help you prepare for the electrical exam. We want to see you succeed. Get that license. Okay. All right, what do we got next? Okay, so let's look and see what we've got. Okay, I'm going to read this question. It says, "Greetings, Paul. You have answered a few of my questions and I enjoy your podcast. I will probably be paying for your classes soon as I am preparing to take my wireman exam. I know with the code changes we are required to install dryers on a GFCI breaker, as this is a blanket requirement that the utility room be GFCI protected. I am a supervisor for a pretty large residential electrical contractor in Texas, and we use mostly Eaton BRs. We have issues constantly with these GFCI breakers with nuisance trips. Sometimes on these warranty calls, we do notice something wrong, such as incorrect wiring within the dryer or an issue at our load center, such as the neutral not terminated in the breaker, but the bus bar." Okay. Just a couple examples. There are a few times we cannot find any issues. Continuity is fine, but the breaker continues to trip. What would you do in this scenario, and have you heard of this happening? We reassure the customer that we use a reliable, high-quality breaker. I usually describe it as a compatibility issue with the GFCI and the specific dryer. Please help. Thanks. That's a great question, and thanks for submitting it in. There's always going to be this issue, potentially, of compatibility issues. Now, granted, GFCIs have come a long way, right? I mean, we're talking the evolution of GFCIs now since all the way back in the 60s have really, really evolved today into very reliable devices. And so typically the reason why, obviously, a GFCI is going to be tripping, one, as you nailed it, is improper wiring or something involved in this scenario. So let me just do this first. The first thing that I would do, rather than you said utility, so we want to kind of address everything that you've kind of talked about there. So first of all, you're in Texas, so you're under the 2020 edition of the National Electrical Code, okay? So the reason is not because it's a utility room. The reason you're doing the requirement for GFCI under 210.8A item 10, which is laundry area. Okay, so it's a laundry area, not just so much utility room, but it's a laundry area. And so in your case, I'm pretty sure that they're synonymous in your use as the same thing. So that's the rule. So you're required to put it in there. Now, it's one of those things where we also have to remember that you have to reach out to the manufacturer. Typically, the GFCI's function is far less a compatibility issue. There's leakage current somewhere. So the way the GFCIs work is the current passes through toroidal coil, and it generates a magnetic field. And of course, AC is expanding, collapsing magnetic field. If it's going out the hot and coming back, let's say back to the actual device, and it's going through this coil, then it's not going to sense any leakage path, and the GFCI is not going to function. So what happens, like with the test button, or if you have leakage current, it gives another path back to the source and back to the breaker. And then what happens is it causes the GFCI to trip. Now, typically, the only way for this to happen is if there is a path that's coming back to the actual breaker that is not going through the toroidal coil. And that would be a problem if you have a piece of equipment that does. So the fact that you found some issues and you found some miswired setups, I think it's doing its job. I don't know how many you find. I personally, since we started the requirement for these dryers and things like that inside of a laundry area to be on GFCI, I have not heard of a lot of cases of these tripping. So I can't tell you that I hear it all the time. What I will tell you is that we just started requiring that, so it's now when I say just, it was prior, I believe 2017 cycle. Don't hold me to that, but we're firmly in it into 2020. And I would reach out to the manufacturer, but what I would do on job site or on the site is I would try a different breaker, a different GFCI breaker, just to rule it out if it keeps tripping. Now, if you say you put it in, it holds, and then you leave and you come back and it trips, if it's a common model of the dryer that you're running into, maybe you're doing these large builders, so you're doing a lot of the spec homes and they're using the same, because typically people bring in their own dryer. That's not something you get when they build the home. So, it's something that you should reach out to the manufacturer, in this case, Eaton, and see if there's a known issue. But you have to be careful because you need to put that GFCI in. Now, some people will say, and I think we've had it for years and we didn't have a problem with it. I do have a little bit of a problem with where we're going with GFCIs, even in the 2023, because even in the 2023 code, we're expanding it so much further. I mean, now it's going to be your ovens and your ranges. And so the dryer is just a tip of what we did and started doing in 2017 and in 2020. I mean, it's all coming. I ain't lying. So it's all coming. And, when you start to look at it, and that's going to be in 210.8D that's going to require those things. And so if they haven't sorted this out, this is going to be happening. But for your case here, I don't have an easy solution, because I know there's some people out there that say just put a 30 amp in it and roll on, right? It just keeps tripping. And there's the other part of me, and I can't do a podcast that's listened to millions of people that download these things over the year. I can't tell you to circumvent the code to put a 30 amp breaker. You got to do you, and you got to do what you got to do. But it requires the code for that to be GFCI protected. Okay, so I'm going to have to put it. So I don't have an easy solution except for you to have another one there. Try a different one. Maybe you got a bad batch or something. And I don't know the numbers that you're talking. I mean, how frequently? I mean, 2 times would make somebody start thinking it's a lot. Is this just a random? The sheer fact that you have gone back and you found miswired or incorrectly wired or, GFCI devices means that you should still continue to do them. Keep doing it. Keep plugging them away in there and keep putting them in. You're going to have to deal. But I would reach out to the manufacturer and really, really gripe on them and say this is becoming an issue and make them aware. Now, I'm not saying that they'll listen to you, because if I told you that Eaton probably would listen to you, I'd be lying. But you got to keep doing your due diligence and keep hammering away at them. You do on this issue. But I don't have any, again, some people will say, and I'm sure I got my listeners that will say that, right? They'll be like, okay, just replace it with a standard breaker. That's the way it's been for years. And if you've got to do that, you do you. And, as long as you're okay with it and, deal with that part of it. Me, I'd put the GFCI back in it because I worry about the liability. But again, like I say, people that listen to my podcast and my TikToks and my YouTubes and all that will say, crap it, Paul. Just put in the regular 30 amp breaker and just rock on. Okay? Well, that's the decision I can't make for you. You need to make your decision for that. Okay? But I'm personally putting in the GFCI, and if it nuisance trips, I'm going to keep reaching out to the manufacturer, that type of thing. Now, even on the worst case scenario, if it just becomes such a problem that you end up having to do a standard breaker, and your customer is going to get ticked off or you keep coming back, then I would have some kind of document for the customer to sign, because then it's a nuisance for them. And you said nuisance, that they're willing to sign it. Otherwise, you need to teach them how to keep resetting it until they can resolve the issue. And I don't know an easy solution for that. But if you want to put a standard breaker back in there, then they need to sign something that says they're aware that it's not GFCI protected in accordance with the new code, and they understand that, and blah, 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 blah. That's the only way I would do it. Now, again, I want to have people that disagree, and that's fine because I'm not here to please everybody. Me personally, I probably put the GFCI in there. If that doesn't work, I try a different one. If it trips a totally separate, different, make sure you have a couple. If it trips the second one, then that tells me there's something wrong with the dryer. And, and again, depending on how old the dryer is, whatever, we're going to see these same issues, I am sure, with the 2023, and we start doing ovens and ranges and cooktops and all these other type of GFCI protection. I am more than sure we're going to have additional issues. But again, typically, it's leakage current, and it's exceeding it. 6 milliamps or greater is making its way back outside a toroidal coil, and it's causing these devices to go off. They don't function like an AFCI, okay? So it's not frequency driven. So something's causing it, unless it is just a bad GFCI. So always have a couple with you. Hope that answers your question. All right, we have another question. Let me go on and read this question, and we'll try to get this knocked out. It says, "Hey, Paul, I hope all is well. Love your videos. I'm learning a lot. I'm installing 3 Lutron smart panels, and each has a capacity of 125 amperes. But of course, they are not going to use the full 125 amperes at the same time because it's basically just low voltage lighting anyways. My question is, can I come out of the 200 amp panel with the 125 amp breaker into a cabinet and splice that circuit into 3 wires for each panel? It's being protected by a breaker that is within sight, and each smart panel is not going to require the full amount anyways. If not, do you have any suggestions? Maybe bring a smaller load to the panel, say 60 amperes. Okay, a couple things I'm going to remind you of here. So this sounds to me like you're wanting to do something like a tap or like a tap rule. So a couple ways that I'll address this, and you're just going to kind of have to pick whichever way that you might do it. Well, obviously, the one thing you could do is come out with 125 amps. Since you're saying that the other ones aren't going to, pull very much load, you could come out with 125 amps, hit a small panel, and that would be a small panel with a 125 amp breaker on it. Okay. Now, of course, here you could just hit a main lug only, right? Because it sounds like it's inside the same building. So come out of the feeder, hit a 125 amp, and then out of there, you could put 3 different 60 amp breakers in it, feeding these 3 Lutron panels. And you'll be limiting the load. And it doesn't matter if the panel's rated 125, you don't need to use it all. You're protecting it. If you're going to put a 60, then you can feed each one of these panels. So it does mean that you would install a remote distribution panel rated at 125 amps, and then you would have individual 60 amp breakers feeding each one of the different Lutron panels. And this way, it gives you a little bit more control over how you would do the installation, right? And your only cost would be a main lug only, something like an 8-circuit panel, so that you can get at least 4 2-poles in there, right? Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, so you can get 4 2-poles in there and do what you need to do, right? The next thing it looks like you're kind of talking like a feeder tap. Of course, being a feeder tap, you got to meet the rules in 240.21b. 1, I'm assuming 10-foot tap rule. The other way that I explained it, you don't really have to worry about any tap rules. Okay, so they're just a feeder, and then out of there, you've got additional feeders going to these Lutron panels, and you put them wherever you want, right? But if you do tap rules, then you got to follow all of these freaking rules in 240.21b. And if it's 10-foot tap rule, and basically remember the whole concept of the feeder tap is to be able to tap a feeder without any overcurrent protection at the tap. So in doing so, we're going to limit you to length. We're going to give you all these rules you have to follow. So for example, if you're doing these panels and they have a main breaker in them and they're rated 125, when you do these 10-foot tap rules, the ampacity of a conductor is from the point where it taps the feeder to these panels. It's got to be one sized large enough to handle the calculated load. So it assumes you're doing a calculation for this Lutron panel, that you know what the load is. And then the second, it says that it has to be not less than the rating of the overcurrent protected device at the termination of the tap conductors. So if you're terminating that into a 125 amp breaker panel for this Lutron, because you said it had a rating of 125, and let's assume it has a breaker, then those conductors have to be sized for that. And since you're supplying this with a feeder at 125 and these panels are rated 125, it kind of defeats the purpose, right? So, probably not the best choice to do that, okay? So you have to meet all of these tap rules. So probably not the best choice that I would do for that application to do that. Now, but bear in mind, I don't know your panels, and you're telling me they're 125. But when you look at these options here, it says not less than. What I'm looking at is 240.21B1, item 1, and there's an A and a B. Now, the A means your conductor, your tap conductors, again, has to handle the calculated load. So it means you did a load calc. You know what the load is, actual load is in each one of these panels. You know what the load is. And B says not less than the rating of the equipment containing the overcurrent device. So you have an overall rating of the equipment, which might be 125, but then the overcurrent device inside of it is not the key driver. Okay, it's inside the equipment. So it's the rating of the equipment containing the overcurrent device that is being supplied by the tap conductors. So that's very broadly to quite a bunch of different equipment that might have that in it. Okay, so that's one thing. But then the second part of that says, or not less than the rating of the overcurrent protected device at the termination of the tap conductors, right? So the or is important because if you come in those panels and it has the ability, and I don't know anything about these panels, Lutron panels, these Lutron Smart, I don't know nothing about them. I have never seen them. They've never asked me to look at them. I don't know anything about them. If you're allowed to change that main breaker, if it doesn't have a main breaker, if it allows for backfeeding and has hold down devices and you can limit it to 60 amps, then those tap conductors, if you follow these rules, the OR would allow you to do it based on the rating of that overcurrent device that it terminates into. And then that might result in smaller conductors. At the end of the day, you have two options here. And as a third, you could come from your main panel and just run separate feeders to each one of these panels and just be done with it. Okay, so if you meet the tap rules, you got to look at what your panels are and look at what your options are. Or the simple solution is to come out with it, put a remote distribution panel in a convenient location, an 8-circuit panel, and then out of that, then you just run your feeders over to each one of these Lutrons. And you're perfectly fine then, because if you do limit it at 60 in this little 8-circuit panel, then it doesn't even matter if the breaker in the Lutron was 125, because really that's just a switch now, just a disconnecting means, right? Okay, but you do have to move it. Now, at the end of the day, if you want to do the feeder tap rules and all that, you still need to make sure that you understand that your total calculated load that's going to be seen on that feeder that's going back to that 125 is not going to cause you any problems with that 125. Okay? So you're going to have to look at that. You're going to have to do your calcs, and you're going to have to make that decision. But I've given you 3 scenarios. Install a small, 125 amp panel right there, main lug only. Come out of that with 60 amp breakers feeding these Lutrons, and you just do it like you would every day. Go in to do the tap rules in 240.21B1. If it's a 10-foot tap rule, follow all the rules. Look at your Lutrons to see if you have the ability to backwire and put a 60 amp as the disconnecting means, the overcurrent protection for that panel board, that smart panel. Look and see if that's an option. If it is, then follow the rules. And again, you would only have to size those feeder taps based on that. Or the third option is run separate feeders from the panel to each one of these Lutron panels and just be done with it. And you could still do that at 60 if you want. You don't have to run 125 to a 125 amp panel. Okay, it has the capacity of that to do that, right? But since you have the 60 upstream, you could have gotten away with a main lug only And so whether it's 125 or 200 or whatnot, if it's being supplied upstream by a 60, it's irrelevant because the 60 is going to limit the current to 60 amperes. Okay. And all that breaker is in the smart panel is just a switch. So that's a bunch of different options. I hope that helped you out and didn't confuse you. But that's kind of based on all you've given me here. That's basically only advice I can give you for that. Okay. Now, others out there might disagree. And I've always got that one guy that wants to stick the thumbs down. Well, until I hear his podcast, there you go. That's the best I can give you for that. Okay, last one. We're going to try to sneak one more in here. It says, this one's addressed to me. It says, hey, Paul, says, where in the NEC can I find requirements for generator cam lock boxes and Kirk Keys systems? All right, well, okay, so cams are also considered single pole separable connectors, and you're going to find that in 406.13. And they even have the pin and sleeve type, which are 406.7. Okay, so again, 406 is going to be the area where you're going to find the information on those type of things. The ones that the females that go onto like the generators and all that, they are still considered from the manufacturers as a receptacle inlet. Okay. And then of course you just need to look at those rules. Now the UL standards are 1681 and 1682. If you want to go looking those things up. Okay. And it kind of will help you get some additional guidance on that. But really, when we're looking for those, we want to look at the guidance under 406.13 or 406.7, depending on what you're dealing with. Okay, so one is pin and sleeve flange, and then one is considered single pole separable connectors. Okay, so I'm sure that's what you're looking at. Also, Google can be your friend. I will tell you that there's a lot of manufacturers. I think Hubble and a bunch of them make these. And so there's a lot of information on those from the manufacturer. Okay, that you can look at as well. The next question was about Kirk Keys. Basically, a Kirk key is an interlocking system, and it's used a lot on the energy systems, or if you have a piece of equipment that has two sources coming in and you want to be able to lock something out. It's more of safety driven than NEC as far as reference to Kirk key. But you might see this in things like hospitals where they have redundant power and things like that. So if you have multiple sources to keep that, being able to shut something down for sequencing, those are where you would use something like a Kirk key. There's actually a website for a company that actually makes Kirk keys. It's kirkkey.com. Check them out. But that's about all the information I can give you on them. I've never installed one. But I know it's an interlock system. So give that a check, and hopefully that'll help you out a little bit. But I don't know that I answered that question for you, but I did my best. So we'll go with that. All right, that's it for today's episode. It's 30-some minutes in, so hopefully you got something out of that. Until next time, folks. And remember, if you've got your questions, I'll do my best. Go to paulabernathy.com, and I will do my best to answer them. Until next time, stay safe. God bless.
Oh yeah. Ask Paul. That's right. Ask Paul. Yeah. Ask Paul. Well, go ahead. Ask it.